Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani.
The words ripped through the darkness like a blade, not whispered, not murmured, screamed. From cracked lips, through a throat raw with blood and thirst, into a sky that had gone black at noon. And the limestone of Golgotha caught the sound and threw it back, so that the crowd heard the cry twice, once from the man, once from the stone, as if the earth itself were asking the same question. My God, why have you forsaken me? This is the most disturbing sentence God ever spoke in human form, the most terrifying prayer ever recorded in Scripture, the most psychologically devastating moment in the history of the universe. But here is the impossible paradox that has haunted theologians for 2,000 years. If Jesus is God, the second person of the Trinity, eternally united with the Father, how can God forsake God? How can the infinite, unbreakable bond within the Godhead shatter? And why, at the very bottom of his agony, did Jesus choose to cry out the opening line of a psalm that ends in triumph? Was this despair or defiance? What we are about to uncover is not a dry theological lecture. It is the most devastating psychological event in human history, and it was designed from before the foundation of the world for you. Picture a boy sitting at a wooden table in Nazareth. He is maybe 12 years old. His hands still smell of sawdust from his father's shop. Around him, his brothers argue over bread. His mother moves between them, settling disputes with a tired smile. It is an ordinary evening, an ordinary family, except for one thing. The boy has never lied, not once. He has never manipulated a sibling to get the larger portion. He has never sulked, never schemed, never harbored a thought he would be ashamed to speak aloud. And the people sitting around this table, the people who love him most, have no idea what to do with that. His forsakenness did not begin on Golgotha. It began here, at this table, in this silence between brothers who shared a roof, but not a world. Jesus of Nazareth lived his entire earthly life without sin. We hear that and imagine serenity, a calm, untroubled existence floating above the mess of human brokenness. But the psychological reality was the opposite. To live as a perfectly pure consciousness inside a world built on self-preservation, ego, and deception was not bliss. It was relentless, agonizing isolation. The Apostle Peter described Lot living in Sodom, a flawed, imperfect man, and said he was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard day after day. Tormented, day after day. And Lot was a sinner himself. Now multiply that torment by infinity. Place a mind that has never known corruption inside a species that breathes it. That was Jesus, every single day. He was, as Isaiah wrote 7 centuries before his birth, despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. But the Hebrew is sharper than the English allows. The word for acquainted is yada, the same word used for the deepest, most intimate knowing between two human beings. Grief was not something Jesus experienced occasionally. It was his companion. It sat with him at that table in Nazareth. It walked beside him through every crowd that wanted his miracles, but not his heart. It lay next to him every night in whatever borrowed room or open field he rested his head. Imagine living your entire life unable to share your deepest thought with another human being, not because you chose silence, but because no one on earth had the capacity to understand. Every conversation incomplete, every friendship with a ceiling, every moment of closeness carrying the quiet ache of a gap that could never close. And it was about to get unimaginably worse. The synagogue in Nazareth was small. Stone walls, wooden benches worn smooth by generations, the smell of lamp oil and old parchment. On this Sabbath, every seat was taken, because the carpenter's son had come home. They had heard the rumors, healings in Capernaum, crowds following him by the thousands. And now here he was, back in the town where they had watched him grow up, standing at the front of the room with a scroll of Isaiah in his hands. He unrolled it, found the passage, and read, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor." He rolled the scroll closed, handed it back to the attendant, sat down. Every eye in the room locked onto him, and then he said 7 words that split the room in 2. "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Silence. A man in the second row shifted. A woman near the back leaned toward her neighbor and whispered something. The elder holding the scroll blinked twice as if he had misheard. "Is this not Joseph's son?" The whisper traveled through the room like a crack through glass. Joseph's son. The boy who used to sweep wood shavings off the shop floor. The teenager who helped carry water from the well. And now he stands here and claims the words of Isaiah belong to him? The murmuring hardened into anger, anger into fury. Hands grabbed his robes. Voices rose. They dragged him through the narrow streets toward the brow of the hill on which the town was built, the cliff edge where they intended to throw him down. And then he passed through the middle of them and walked away. No miracle, no thunder, no fire from heaven. Just a man walking away from the only place that was supposed to be home. The dust of Nazareth still on his sandals, the voices of his neighbors still ringing in his ears. He did not go back. Have you ever stood in a room full of people and felt completely invisible? Have you ever realized that the people who say they know you don't? The rejection expanded outward in concentric circles. His own brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, Judas, and unnamed sisters, lived alongside him for decades and concluded he was deluded. John records it with devastating simplicity. For even his own brothers did not believe in him. The men who shared his mother's table, his father's shop, his childhood home, they looked at him and saw a stranger. They see the miracles, they hear the teaching, but they look at me and see a stranger wearing their brother's face. The crowds were worse in a different way. They wanted his hands, the hands that healed, the hands that multiplied bread. They did not want his heart. They wanted a vending machine that performed miracles, not a Messiah who demanded transformation. The crowd that screamed, "Hosanna" on Sunday, screamed, "Crucify him" by Friday. Same voices, same city, same week. But through all of it, the hometown rejection, the family that didn't believe, the crowds that commodified him, the religious leaders who plotted his death, there was one circle that had not yet broken. 3 men he had chosen above the rest: Peter, James, John. The inner circle. The last human barrier between Jesus and total isolation. That barrier was about to collapse. The Garden of Gethsemane sits on the western slope of the Mount of Olives. The name itself is a wound, Gethsemane, the oil press. It was where olives were crushed until they surrendered their oil. And on this night, it became the place where the Son of God was crushed under a weight no human mind was built to carry. The air smelled of pressed oil and damp stone. The Passover moon hung full and pale above the ancient olive trees, some of them already centuries old, their trunks twisted into shapes that looked, in the silver light, like men frozen mid-prayer. Somewhere in the city below, a lamb bleated, one of thousands being prepared for sacrifice. None of them knew they were all shadows of the one true Lamb who knelt, at this very moment, in the dirt between the roots. Jesus walked deeper into the garden, past the 8, taking only Peter, James, and John. His steps slowed. His breathing changed, shorter, shallower, as if the air itself had thickened. And then he stopped and turned to them with an honesty so raw it should terrify anyone who reads it. "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death." This is not stoic composure. This is not dignified suffering. This is a man telling his closest friends that the grief inside him is so heavy, it is physically killing him. He is asking them, "Stay awake, stay close. I need you tonight in a way I have never needed anyone." He walked a stone's throw farther and fell on his face. The cold earth pressed against his forehead. The roots of the olive tree dug into his knees. And then the weight descended. Not the weight of the cross, that was still hours away. The weight of sin. Every sin. Past, present, future. Every lie ever whispered between lovers. Every hand raised against a child. Every prayer spoken with a mouth that did not mean a word of it. The mind that had never harbored a single dark thought now absorbed the full catalog of human evil, not as concepts, but as experience, as if he had committed each one himself. Luke records what happened next with clinical precision. "And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground." Hematidrosis, a documented medical condition where extreme psychological distress causes the capillaries in the sweat glands to rupture. The stress inside his body was so severe that his skin began to weep blood. The drops fell into the dirt of the garden, mixing with the soil, soaking into the roots of trees that had been pressed for oil for centuries. Another kind of pressing, another kind of oil. He prayed, he begged, he wrestled. Then he stood, wiped the blood from his face with the back of his hand, walked back to the 3 men he trusted most on earth. They were asleep. Peter's head rested against a rock, mouth slightly open. James lay curled on his side, arms wrapped around himself against the night chill. John's breathing came slow and even, the rhythm of a man without a care in the world. Jesus stood over them. The blood on his face had already begun to dry in the cool air. He looked at Peter, the man who had sworn hours earlier that he would die before he would abandon him. Asleep. The man who had walked on water at the sound of Jesus' voice could not keep his eyes open for 60 minutes at the sound of Jesus' pain. I asked for 1 hour. 1. And even this was too much. Could you not watch with me 1 hour? The question floated into the dark air. No one answered, because no one was awake to hear it. He went back, prayed again, returned, asleep again. A 3rd time, asleep again. 3 times he reached for human comfort. 3 times he found nothing but the sound of breathing that belonged to someone else's peace. Have you ever needed someone so badly it felt like your chest would collapse and they were not there? Have you ever cried out and heard only your own echo? And then the torches appeared through the trees, orange light flickering between the olive branches, the sound of boots on gravel, metal clinking against metal. Judas stepped forward, kissed him on the cheek. The most intimate gesture of friendship, weaponized into a signal for arrest. Peter drew a sword and swung wildly, cutting off a servant's ear. Then, hours later, in a courtyard lit by a charcoal fire, a servant girl pointed at him. "You were with him." Peter's voice cracked. "I don't know the man." He said it 3 times. And somewhere on a rooftop nearby, a rooster inhaled. The others didn't even wait that long. They ran, every single one, into the darkness, into the night. Gone. And Jesus stood alone in the torchlight, surrounded by soldiers, abandoned by every friend he had on earth. And here we must pause, because the instinct is to look at this scene and blame the disciples, to call Judas evil, to call Peter weak, to call the others cowards. But the terrifying truth is simpler than that. Every one of them did exactly what you or I would have done. Judas believed he was forcing God's hand, a twisted faith, not pure malice. He may have genuinely expected Jesus to reveal his power when cornered, to overthrow Rome in a blaze of divine fury. His betrayal was not the absence of belief. It was belief pointed in the wrong direction. Peter loved Jesus enough to follow him into the high priest's courtyard, but not enough to die there. And the others ran because running is what humans do when the cost of staying becomes real. The disciples were not villains. They were mirrors. And the face you see in them is your own. Before a single nail pierced his flesh, every layer of human support had been systematically demolished. Family, hometown, nation, crowds, friends, inner circle, all gone. The psychological architecture of his human life had been dismantled brick by brick, circle by circle, until nothing remained but a man, utterly alone, standing in torchlight, surrounded by enemies, with blood drying on his face that no one had bothered to wipe away. Inside the temple, a priest laid a lamb across the altar. The animal's legs were bound. The knife was sharpened. It was the 9th hour, the hour of sacrifice, and the smell of burning flesh and incense drifted through the corridors of the holy place. Everything was as it had been for 1,000 years. Ritual, order, the rhythm of atonement. Outside the city walls, at that same hour, Roman soldiers were laying a different body across a different piece of wood. His legs were not bound. They were held. The nails were counted. 3. The hammer was raised. 2 sacrifices, one planned by men, one planned before the foundation of the world. To view Roman crucifixion as merely an execution is to miss the point entirely. Crucifixion was not designed to kill. It was designed to erase. The Romans engineered it as a technology of total psychological destruction, what modern researchers call social death. The systematic stripping of identity, dignity, and belonging from a living human being until they cease to exist as a person, long before they cease to exist as a body. They stripped him naked. They whipped him until the flesh hung from his back in wet ribbons. They pressed a crown of long, thorned branches into his scalp, each thorn driving through skin into bone, blood running into his eyes and mixing with sweat until the world blurred red. And then they nailed him to the wood and dropped the cross into the post hole. The jolt traveled through every joint in his body. His shoulders wrenched against the nails, his spine slammed against the rough wood. And then, stillness. The awful, swinging stillness of a body suspended between sky and earth, belonging to neither. Crucifixion victims hung at eye level. The mockers did not shout from a distance. They leaned in, close enough to smell the iron in his blood, close enough for Jesus to see every face clearly, every sneer, every curled lip, every pair of eyes that looked at him and saw nothing worth saving. He saved others, he cannot save himself. Matthew 27:42. They used his own miracles as weapons. Every healing, every resurrection, every blind man who saw again, thrown back in his face as proof of his failure. And there, in the small group standing closest to the cross, Close enough to be splattered by the blood dripping from his feet, stood his mother. Mary did not run. She did not collapse. She stood. John records it with 3 words that carry the weight of an ocean. His mother. She had held this body when it was small enough to fit in her arms. She had pressed her ear to his infant chest and listened to his heartbeat. Strong, steady, impossibly fast the way newborns' hearts beat. She had cleaned his scrapes, sung him to sleep, watched him take his first steps across the dirt floor of their home in Nazareth. Now she watched him struggle to breathe. Every inhale required him to push upward against the nails in his feet, dragging his shredded back against the wood, lifting his chest long enough to pull air into lungs that were slowly filling with fluid. Every exhale, he sagged back down. Push up, breathe, sag down, suffocate. Push up, breathe. She watched this, and she stood. And then the sky went dark. From the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. Matthew 27:45. Noon to 3 in the afternoon. This was not a solar eclipse. Passover falls on a full moon, and solar eclipses are physically impossible during a full moon. This was supernatural, and every Jew standing at the foot of that cross would have recognized it immediately. The 9th plague of Egypt, darkness that could be felt. God was replaying the Exodus, but this time the judgment did not fall on Pharaoh. It fell on his own son. The birds stopped mid-song. The wind died as if the air itself had been told to hold its breath. The temperature dropped. Jerusalem sits high in the Judean hills, and without the sun, the air turns cold fast. The sweat on his body cooled. His muscles, already seizing from hours of strain, began to cramp harder in the chill. And at the foot of the cross, a Roman centurion, a man who had supervised dozens of executions without flinching, looked up at the impossible sky and felt something he had not felt since he was a boy. Fear. Not the fear of battle. He knew that fear. It was manageable, predictable. This was different. This was the fear of a man standing at the edge of something vast and invisible, something that operated by rules he did not understand and could not fight. In 20 years of military service, he had watched men die cursing, begging, screaming for their mothers. He had never watched the sky die with them. He had never felt the ground tremble beneath his sandals while a prisoner prayed for the men who nailed him there. Something was wrong. Not wrong the way a battle goes wrong. Wrong the way the world goes wrong. As if the foundations of something enormous and unseen were shifting. The Apostle Paul later described what was happening in that darkness. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. The Greek word is hamartia, sin itself. But in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the same word translates the Hebrew for sin offering in Leviticus 4. Jesus did not merely carry sin. He became the sacrifice, the animal on the altar, the lamb with the knife at its throat. And the prophet Habakkuk had already established the unbearable equation. God is of purer eyes than to see evil, and cannot look at iniquity. The Father's holiness and the Son's sin-bearing collided in the darkness over Golgotha, and the result was silence. Total, crushing, cosmic silence. Inside him, the darkness was worse than anything the sky could produce. Not a list of sins, a flood. Faces he had never seen, hands he had never held, a woman weeping in a room he had never entered, a child hiding under a table in a house that would not be built for 1,000 years, a man standing on a bridge in a city that did not yet exist, looking down at black water, whispering, nobody would even notice. All of them, all at once, and every one of them, his. As if he had committed every act, spoken every lie, broken every promise, ignored every cry. Where are you? I have never not known the sound of your voice. I have never reached for you and found empty air. Father. Silence. There is a kind of darkness that has nothing to do with the sky. You know it. The darkness that fills a room after a phone call with the worst news. The darkness that sits in your chest at 3 a.m. when sleep will not come and God will not answer. He was inside that darkness now, and for 3 hours, heaven said nothing. 3 hours. The darkness had not lifted. The crowd had grown quieter. Even the mockers had exhausted themselves. The only sounds on Golgotha, the labored, rattling breath of dying men, the creak of wood shifting under weight, the quiet weeping of the women who had not left. And somewhere below the hill, the distant bleating of Passover lambs being led to temple altars, their blood pooling on stone floors at the exact same hour that his blood pooled in the dirt beneath the cross. Jesus opened his eyes. The world was dark. Not the darkness of night, which has stars, not the darkness of a room, which has walls. A darkness with no edges, no floor, no ceiling. A darkness that felt like a mouth. His lips were cracked white. His body had been failing for hours. The blood loss from the scourging, the dehydration, the slow suffocation as his diaphragm collapsed under the weight of his own frame. Every breath required a decision. Push up against the nails. Drag the shredded back against the wood. Expand the lungs. Pull in air that tasted like iron and dust. Sag back down. Repeat. Every single breath for the last 6 hours had cost him a deliberate act of will. But what was happening inside him was worse than any nail. He reached inward, toward the place where the Father's presence had lived since before time began. The place that had never been empty. Not when he was an infant in the manger. Not when he fasted 40 days in the wilderness. Not when the crowds turned and the Pharisees plotted and the disciples misunderstood everything he said. Through all of it, the Father had been there. A warmth behind the sternum, a voice beneath the silence, a presence so constant that it was like a heartbeat, unnoticed until it stops. It had stopped. He reached for it and found nothing. Not anger, not punishment, not the heat of divine wrath. Something far worse. Absence. The way a house feels when everyone has left and the last car has pulled out of the driveway and you stand in the hallway listening to the clock tick. The way a room feels after a coffin has been carried out. Absence. The specific, suffocating physical weight of something that should be there and is not. He knew, somewhere in the part of him that was still divine, still connected, still the eternal Word through whom all things were made, he knew the Father had not left. The Trinity had not fractured. The bond that held the Godhead together was older than the universe and stronger than death, and it had not broken. He knew this the way you know the sun exists on a day so cloudy you cannot find it in the sky. It is there. The math demands it. The planets still orbit. But he could not feel it. His human mind, the mind that felt hunger the way you feel hunger, that felt exhaustion the way you feel exhaustion, that felt grief the way you feel grief, reached for the Father and touched empty air. And the agony of that emptiness was greater than the nails, greater than the thorns, greater than the whip. Because those tortured his body, this tortured the deepest place inside him that had never known a single moment without the Father's voice. This was not the echo of loneliness. This was the source, the original separation, the very thing that happened in the Garden of Eden when Adam heard God's voice and hid. The fracture between creator and creature, the moment when a human being first knew what it felt like to be cut off from the source of all life and all light. Every human being who has ever felt distant from God is feeling a ripple from that first fracture. Jesus was not feeling the ripple. He was feeling the earthquake. And he screamed. Not in Hebrew, the liturgical language of formal prayer, the language of the synagogue, the language of ritual. In Aramaic, his mother tongue, the language of childhood, the language of scraped knees and nightmares, and a boy calling for his father in the dark. Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? The sound hit the limestone of Golgotha and bounced. The women at the foot of the cross flinched. The centurion's hand tightened on his spear. And some in the crowd, the ones who spoke only Greek and Latin, misheard the Aramaic and said, "He is calling for Elijah." They didn't understand. They couldn't. The most important sentence ever spoken, and the people standing closest to it could not even identify the language. But he was not calling for Elijah. He was quoting Psalm 22, and every educated Jew at the foot of that cross knew it. Psalm 22, written by King David 1,000 years earlier, begins in the absolute depths. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? It descends into social mockery. I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. It describes physical agony with terrifying precision. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breast. And then, a detail that should make every skeptic pause. They have pierced my hands and my feet. Written a millennium before the Romans invented crucifixion as a method of execution. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. The soldiers gambling for his robe at the foot of the cross were fulfilling a prophecy they had never read, written in a language they did not speak, about a God they did not worship. But Psalm 22 does not end in despair. At verse 24, the song pivots with a force that cracks the darkness wide open. For he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hidden his face from him, but has heard when he cried to him. And from there, the psalm erupts, not into quiet hope, but into cosmic triumph. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord. Future generations not yet born will be told of his righteousness. The dying will worship. The nations will bow. The song that begins with a scream ends with the sound of the entire earth singing. Jesus knew this. He knew the trajectory. He knew the ending. And he chose, with the last reserves of breath in lungs that were filling with fluid, to scream the opening line of a song that ends in victory. This was not faithlessness. This was the most defiant act of faith in the history of the universe. He could not feel God. He could not hear God, but he would not release the claim. Notice the pronoun, my God. Not, God, why have you forsaken me? My God. Even in the abyss of total abandonment, when every nerve in his human body was screaming that he had been discarded, when the silence of heaven pressed down like a stone on his chest, he held on. That single, desperate my is the thinnest thread of faith ever spoken. A possessive pronoun carrying the weight of eternity. And it held. Against the crushing mass of every sin ever committed. Against the silence of heaven itself. It held. He weaponized scripture against the darkness. He screamed his pain into the psalm that promised God would answer. He grabbed the oldest words of faith he knew and hurled them into the void, not because the void answered, but because the act of hurling them was itself the answer. Lament is not the opposite of faith. It is faith's most ancient and most desperate expression, and Jesus modeled it with his last breath. Somewhere beneath the silence, beneath the darkness, beneath the weight of every sin that had ever been committed or would ever be committed, something held. Not a voice, not a word, a presence, faint as a heartbeat heard through a wall. The way you can feel someone standing in a dark room, even when you cannot see them. The Father's heart, still beating, still there, still his. It is finished. He bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Inside the temple, the priests were mid-ritual. The incense burned, the prayers continued. The Passover lambs bled on the altar. And then, a sound. Not from outside, from above, from the ceiling. A tearing, deep, structural, impossible. The great curtain, 60 feet tall, 30 feet wide, woven thick as a man's hand, split. From the top, not from the bottom up, which would suggest human hands. From the top down, as if an invisible hand had gripped the upper edge and ripped it apart like parchment. The rush of air from the Holy of Holies hit the priests' faces, the air from the room no one entered except the high priest once a year. Sacred air, forbidden air. And now it was pouring out, uncontained, unguarded, filling the corridor, touching everyone. The barrier between God and humanity ripped open by God himself. And back on the hill, the centurion stared at the body on the cross, the man who had died without cursing, who had prayed for the soldiers who nailed him there, who had spoken to his mother with tenderness while his lungs collapsed, who had screamed into a darkness that no Roman god could explain. The centurion's lips moved. The words came out quiet, not a declaration for the crowd, but a confession for himself. The kind of sentence a man speaks when every certainty he has built his life on has just crumbled. Truly, this man was the Son of God. The silence that fell over Golgotha that afternoon has echoed through 20 centuries. It echoes still, in hospital rooms at midnight, in empty apartments after the funeral guests leave, in the chest of every human being who has ever whispered into the dark, "Where are you?" God the Father did not ontologically forsake Jesus on the cross. The Trinity held. The bond was never severed at the level of being. But the experience of forsakenness was completely, devastatingly, psychologically real. The trauma was genuinely endured. The Son of God emptied himself into total, unshielded communion with the full horror of human sin and human isolation. He felt what the abandoned feel. He screamed what the abandoned scream. He endured the silence that the abandoned endure. And the Father answered. Not immediately, not on Friday. Friday was silence. Saturday was the grave. Cold stone, linen wrappings, the smell of myrrh and aloes in a borrowed tomb. A body that had calmed storms and raised the dead, lying motionless in the dark. But on the first day of the week, before the sun had cleared the horizon, while the stone still sealed the entrance and the guards still stood at their posts, something moved. In the silence of the tomb, where no heartbeat had sounded for 3 days, a pulse, a breath, linen settling flat against an empty shelf, and an absence, not the terrifying absence of the cross, but a glorious one. the absence of a body that was no longer there because death could not hold it. The Father's answer to Psalm 22, delivered not in words, but in resurrection. For he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hidden his face from him, but has heard when he cried to him, fulfilled, just as it was written. The book of Hebrews puts it with a directness that should bring every broken heart to its knees. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are. This is not abstract theology. This is God saying, I have been where you are. I have screamed into silence. I have felt the floor disappear beneath me. And I am still here. If you have ever sat on the edge of a bed at 2 a.m., phone in your hand, scrolling through contacts, wondering who you could possibly call, wondering if anyone would pick up, wondering if anyone would care, you are not alone in that room. Because the God of the universe once knelt in a garden and reached for his closest friends and found them sleeping. He once hung between earth and sky and reached for his Father and found silence. He knows the exact weight of the phone in your hand when there is no one to call. The silence of Friday does not mean the absence of God. It means God is doing something so deep, so costly, so world-shattering, that even heaven holds its breath. Your Friday is not the end of your story, because his wasn't. What does it mean to you, truly, personally, that God himself experienced the silence of God? Think about that. And if this reached something inside you today, share it with someone who is living in their own Friday, someone who needs to hear that Sunday is coming. Subscribe, and we'll walk through the scriptures together, story by story, truth by truth, until every shadow gives way to light.